This meeting is being recorded.
And a little bit logistics that if you have any questions, please post them on the chat and we'll read them after the presentation is completed. And as you heard that this meeting is being recorded. If you do not want to be recorded, you're welcome to exit and watch the recording. And right now is I wanted to it is an honor to introduce today's speaker, Michelle Evans, an expert storyteller and researcher who has brought one of the most fascinating chapters in aerospace history to life. Michelle is the author of the X-15 rocket plane flying the first wings into space, a meticulously researched book that explores the groundbreaking X-15 program. Through interviews with nearly 70 key individuals, including 9 of the 12 pilots who flew the X-15, such as Neil Armstrong and Robert White, Michelle has captured the human side of this incredible story. Her work highlights not only the technical achievement, but also the people behind the record-breaking hypersonic rocket plane. The X-15 program was a precursor to the Space Shuttle, making history as the first piloted and winged vehicle to leave Earth's atmosphere and return with a controlled landing. Michelle's talk will take us behind the scenes of this remarkable aircraft, its pilots, and the engineers, and the technicians who made it all possible. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Michelle Evans.
Thank you very much for having me here today. Let me do the share screen and bring everything up. And you should be seeing the slides. Is everything working on your end?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for having me here with the Houston AIAA. I'm Michelle Evans, and I'm here to tell you the story of the most amazing experimental rocket plane that ever took to the skies. But more importantly, I want to introduce you to the people who made it all happen. This is the X-15 rocket plane and the men who flew the first wings into space. Let me start with a short excerpt. This is the beginning of chapter 5 from my book. Eons of hot, dry sun baked the ancient lake bottom to near asphalt hardness, the color bleached to a dirty white. Close up, the surface was crisscrossed with fissures, giving it the look of dragon scales. Seasonal rain repeatedly scoured the top layer smooth. Roughly circular, the dry lake was more than 5 miles across, a perfect oasis of level ground among the scattered hills surrounding the area. Southeast of the silver boomtown from the early 1900s of Tonopah, Nevada, the lake was given the inauspicious name of Mud. No vegetation marred the pristine surface. Maybe an occasional lizard, snake, jackrabbit, or coyote might dart across the outer edges, but there was little reason for any living thing to trek across the vastness of that silent interior. All these inhospitable qualities were perfect for one special purpose. On the morning of 9 November 1962, that purpose was fulfilled as the quiet was shattered by a sonic boom. The X-15, with pilot Jack McKay at the controls, had not achieved full thrust after launch, so he needed a place to land. Mud Dry Lake was directly to the east of his flight track. He turned and made for the ground. As he neared touchdown, McKay set the flaps, but they did not respond. His landing was going to be very fast. The rear skid slapped down, followed quickly by the nose gear. Bouncing slightly, the left rear skid failed under the strain. A chain reaction now began as the crippled aircraft went out of control. The left wing and rear stabilizer scraped along the ground, ripping the stabilizer from its mount. The wing continued to slide, pivoting the aircraft, then flipping the X-15 onto its back. As the accident unfolded for McKay, time slowed as adrenaline kicked in, heightening his test pilot reflexes. Jack sensed the beginning of the flip, instinctively reaching for the canopy jettison switch. He knew if the aircraft went over, he would be trapped inside if it remained in place. The aircraft came to rest on its back as McKay had feared, but with the canopy gone, the weight of the aircraft now transferred directly to Jack's helmet, compressing his neck. A helicopter moved in, using its downwash to keep the area clear of fumes from the toxic fuels aboard the stricken rocket plane. It took 9 years to achieve Mach 1, Mach 2, and Mach 3. The last of these cost the life of Mel Abt. Gaining speed was a dangerous business. Yet a winged rocket ship which could double those records in just a few short years went into development, the X-15 rocket plane. Scott Crossfield left the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics to work at North American Aviation to help design, build, and fly the X-15. Scott is seen here with the chief pilots for the NACA and U.S. Air Force, Joe Walker and Ivan Kinchlow. Unfortunately, Ivan did not survive long enough to fly the X-15 himself. He was killed in a terrible accident of an F-104 before that ever happened. Now, construction at the North American Aviation Facility near Los Angeles International Airport was kept from prying eyes. You can see they actually put up a fence so that other employees who didn't have the need to know had nothing to do with the X-15 and couldn't see what was happening. Until 15 October of 1958, just 2 weeks after NASA was formed, the X-15 was unveiled to the public and all that classification disappeared. Vice President Nixon that day said, "The X-15 is exciting because of the fact that it is designed to carry man into space for the first time. It is an integral part of an orderly and reasoned space program. These pilots are men to be envied, for theirs will be the ultimate goal toward which men's dreams have stretched for centuries. It is useless for me to cite their bravery. We can only envy them for the opportunity which is theirs." Now, an integral part of the X-15 was the MC-2 pressure suit, seen here worn by Scott Crossfield inside of the heat facility to make sure it would properly protect him from the heat of hypersonic flight. Now, this suit was created by the David Clark Company, which had previously specialized in the manufacture of women's undergarments. Crossfield once wrote about the Clark Company, "The structural loads imposed on a girdle, as we all know, can be tremendous, and a machine which can build a good one automatically is an amazing engineering accomplishment." With his ingenious machine, Clark had all but cornered the important, shall we say, expanding girdle market. Braving new frontiers, Clark moved into the manufacture of brassieres, which, considering those structural loads, was even more awesome. And this then gave the David Clark Company the proper foundation on which to build America's first spacesuits. Now, the cockpit was a very tight fit on the X-15, as you can see in this extreme fisheye view. But he actually had fairly good view outside the cockpit. The windows were right there next to his helmet, so he could see out pretty well. Now, they prepared for months for the first flight, but problems kept the X-15 in the hangar or attached to the B-52 mothership, where it was repeatedly fueled and checked out. And on Monday, 8 June 1959, the X-15 finally achieved its first flight, dropping from the B-52's wing at 8:38 a.m. Scotty expertly glided the unpowered X-15 toward the Rogers Dry Lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert. As he neared landing, Scotty experienced a near disastrous pilot-induced oscillation. He created an up and down porpoising motion, but he was able to expertly touch down at the bottom of one of these oscillations, and the first flight was a success. Scotty had microphones in his face before he could leave the cockpit. At this time, everyone thought the X-15 would be the vehicle to put the first man into space. The second X-15 soon joined the fleet, making the first powered flight on 17 September 1959. Rocket engine development, unfortunately, was behind schedule, so the XLR-11 rockets were installed. These are the same which had powered Chuck Yeager and the X-1 to the first supersonic flight in 1947. The LR-11s worked perfectly, and touchdown of that first powered flight. The second flight went well as well, but the third powered flight did not go quite as planned, as you can see here. There was a fire in the engine compartment after launch and an overweight landing because the jettison tubes to get rid of the fuel were burned through. So when he hit, it literally broke the back of the X-15, number 2. But number 1 was there to continue the flight testing, while number 2 was sent back to North America for repairs. And even though it broke the back of the vehicle, it only took a couple of months before it re-entered service. Now, while the initial flight tests continued, the third X-15 was being prepped for the 60,000-pound thrust XLR-99 rocket engine, which is what the X-15 was designed to use in the first place. Now, at the propulsion system test facility, they could test fire up to 2 X-15s at any one time. They had 2 test stands with the blockhouse there in the middle. But the thing I want to point out in this specific photograph is way up in the upper left-hand corner, you'll note a red and white Beechcraft Bonanza that was owned by Scott Crossfield. Scott's daughter, Sally, told me in the X-15 days, he started flying his Bonanza to and from Edwards because we'd moved from Lancaster down to Los Angeles, and this was the only way he could get any home time. The powers that be did not like him flying his personal plane because they thought it was too dangerous. Seems a bit ironic for a pilot of a hypersonic research aircraft. Now, this is what a successful LR-99 engine firing should look like in the test stand. But on 8 June of 1960, it did not go quite as planned. A valve stuck, causing a fuel explosion, literally blowing the X-15 in half. Scotty, in the forward section of the X-15, shot forward 25 feet. He experienced over 100 instantaneous Gs. He did not suffer any major injury, at least not that he admitted at the time. He actually suffered a retinal detachment. But after being hosed down by firemen, when they opened the cockpit, he was just sitting there in his business suit that day. Scotty famously said the headline should read, "Aircraft blows up, pilot wets pants." Now, here's one of the only photos showing the first 4 primary pilots on the X-15. You have Forrest Peterson, was the prime pilot from the US Navy. Scott Crossfield, the contractor pilot from North American. Robert White was now the Air Force's primary pilot after the loss of Ivan Kinchlow. And Joe Walker from NASA. Notice that Forrest Peterson of the US Navy was often left out, as you can see in this publicity photo. Now, finally, Scotty had to leave. Here, Bob White symbolically takes the keys from Scotty while Neil Armstrong of NASA looks on. They were really anxious to get going. There had been a time when Scott said he was the best qualified person to be flying this program because of his intimate knowledge of this aircraft. But the Air Force was paying for the program. NASA was running the program. So they said, finish the contracted flights. We want to move on and do our own program. Now, here's a typical mission profile for an X-15. The X-15 was the very first experimental aircraft that needed to leave the local area of Edwards Air Force Base. It required a 400-mile-long corridor known as the High Range, with 2 tracking stations that followed every flight besides the primary down at Edwards, from Beatty, Nevada, just east of Death Valley, up to Ely near the northeastern corner of the state, 9,300 feet up in the mountains, where, as you can see here, it gets just a bit cold at times. When I tried to travel up to Ely myself, I was actually turned back by snow, even in the middle of June. Now here's a group shot of the first batch of X-15 pilots, primary and backup. Bookending the photograph, you've got Robert Rushworth, who is the backup Air Force pilot, with Robert White, the prime pilot, on the other end. And then you've got Jack McKay, who is now the backup pilot for Joe Walker with NASA, and Neil Armstrong, who is the second backup at NASA at that time. Note that Forrest Peterson was the only pilot for the Navy. He never had a backup problem or a backup pilot. Now, first up after Scotty was Joe Walker, and he was a relaxed old country boy from the backwoods of Pennsylvania. Here he is stepping out of the suiting van and heading for the X-15 and dropping away on the very first NASA flight on 25 March of 1960. Notice that NASA wasted no time in emblazoning their bright yellow logo on the rocket plane's tail. They wanted the world to know who was in charge of the X-15. Now, I want to compare the post-recovery requirements of an X-15 here. This is fairly early in the program, so there's actually a lot more people out there than normally would be. But you had a few vehicles, some people out inspecting the aircraft, et cetera, and you know, the X-15 lands just a couple of miles from where it is housed at the NASA facility. But remember that this is all happening at the same time that Mercury, Gemini, Apollo are flying us to the moon, which required an entire naval flotilla when one of those vehicles came back from space. Now, Joe Walker took the X-15 to the heights. On 22 August of 1963, Walker topped out the X-15 program at 354,200 feet. That's 67.1 miles, or about 10 miles above where you would, about 10 times the height of a commercial airliner. And with no air, attitude control jets, as you see here, were required to keep the rocket plane properly oriented before a human-controlled reentry. And here's the curvature of the Earth as seen by the pilots of the X-15. Joe's eloquent perspective of this flight, he said, "The overhead aspect is just like one of these dark velvet cloths as far as the sky's appearance, but there aren't any specks of light shining through that I could pick out." He remarked, "By gosh, it's dark up here today. Quite a different view. What a beautiful day it is." It can probably be said that of the 12 X-15 pilots, Joe appeared to enjoy the ride more than anyone else. He said, "You got a long time to where you find yourself having done your looking around and figuring, well, if I'd had better sense, I would have looked around more." Joe completed his stint on the X-15 and left to become NASA's chief pilot on the XB-70A Valkyrie bomber. On 8 June 1966, Walker was flying an F-104 as part of a 5-aircraft formation centered on this giant bomber. His F-104, seen here with the orange tail below the B-70, was asked to move in tighter to the B-70 for these photographs. He was caught in the wingtip vortex and flipped over the top of the B-70. A frantic call of "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" went out over the air. Walker was killed instantly as the F-104 rolled across the top of the bomber. The B-70 was also crippled and went down minutes later, killing co-pilot Carl Cross. But B-70 pilot Al White, who had been Crossfield's backup on the X-15, even though he never got to fly the program, did survive, but with very serious injuries. Now, the prime pilot for the Air Force was Robert White, seen here with Joe Walker while he was still flying the program. These two guys were the primary X-15 record setters. Here, White prepares for the drop in a very short 10-minute rocket flight to come. That's all it was. Once you dropped off the wing of the B-52, you had about 10 minutes until you were going to be on the ground somewhere. In this photo, you can see the white of his helmet. His head is down. He's checking his switch positions as he prepares to launch himself from the wing pylon. Now, Bob White was the only man to be the first person to surpass 3 Mach numbers, and yet few people know his name today. Everybody knows Chuck Yeager broke Mach 1. Scott Crossfield was the first to cross Mach 2. And of course, Mel Abt was the first Mach 3, and he lost his life in doing so. But Bob White was the first to surpass Mach 4, Mach 5, and Mach 6, an amazing achievement. Bob told me, you know, I didn't realize until afterward that I was the first Mach 4, 5, and 6. Now, some NASA guy had said, hey, wait a minute, we want Joe Walker to break one of these here too. I'm not quite sure what would have happened. The Air Force really loved to set records. Now, White was very proud of his skills as an X-15 pilot, so much so that he bet a friend on the program, a martini, that he could set that rocket plane down within just 1,000 feet of the planned touchdown point. Now, it may seem like a lot, but that's not bad when you consider he's gliding back from suborbital space using 1950s analog technology. And he won that bet on nearly every one of his 16 flights. Bob really did like his martinis. And after becoming the first pilot to exceed 300,000 feet on 17 July 1962, White had to get out very quick to catch a flight and head back for Washington, D.C., where he was to receive the Collier Trophy with fellow X-15 pilots Crossfield, Walker, and Peterson. That day, President Kennedy said, "We're very proud of these 4 young men who are among the finest who have taken a manned aircraft into space yesterday to over 300,000 feet and at over 4,000 miles per hour. We are very proud to have them here, not only for what they have done in space, but also because they represent the kind of Americans whom we want this country to be identified with. We hope that their example will encourage others to do something that requires reaching beyond what we now know and what we now do." Now here's a comparison of the LR-11 and LR-99 rocket engines. It took 2 of the 4-chambered LR-11 stacked on top of each other and mounted to the X-15 to achieve 16,000 pounds of thrust, whereas the LR-99, with a small 6-foot package and 1 single chamber, punched in with 60,000 pounds of thrust. It was also the very first rocket engine capable of being throttled. They could go from 30% to 100% thrust with this engine, later restricted to 50% to 100%. But it was the kind of engine that finally led to things like the Space Shuttle main engine, which was able to throttle and made that program possible. Here's the twin LR-11s firing in the test stand as configured for the X-15, and the X-15 under power with the twin LR-11s. Maximum speed achieved with this rocket package was Mach 3.5, but that was only half of what was envisioned for using the LR-11. Now here's a very impressive single chamber LR-99 firing in the test stand and installed in an X-15 ready for flight. Now Forrest Peterson was the only US Navy X-15 pilot. While serving on the X-15, he was up for promotion, but to get that in the Navy required sea duty. Now that's hard to come by when you're assigned to a base in the desert. A way was found around this requirement by assigning him to a naval squadron just north of Edwards at the China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station. Peterson said, all they did was assign me to that squadron up at China Lake, yet I stayed at my same office at Edwards where I'd always been. And China Lake was just as landlocked as Rogers Dry Lake at Edwards, but that didn't matter. After a year, I accumulated my so-called sea duty, and they promoted me to commander. And as you can see, an enterprising technician at NASA put a nice little shield on the side of the vehicle to commemorate that for his next flight. Now, on 10 January 1962, Peterson made his final flight in the program, which turned out to also be the first emergency landing outside of Edwards. After landing safely at Mud Lake near Tonopah, Nevada, the X-15 had to be trucked overland back to Edwards. It's about a 250 mile drive through these winding desert roads. And so after a long trip, that always requires a stop along the way for gas and a snack. And I always love this photograph because, of course, you see most of the people looking at the X-15, but notice the group of people out on the right-hand side, they're all looking outward. It looks like their fathers are out there taking pictures for the family. I would love to find a copy of one of those pictures someday. Now, Forrest Peterson had to leave the X-15 program in order to resume his naval career, which included commanding the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. I guess you could say he was the original Captain Kirk. Now, Jack McKay is seen here with his wife Shirley and first daughter Sherry, who came aboard as the second NASA X-15 pilot. I mentioned first daughter because this family will eventually have 8 children in their family. I don't know what it was about these rocket planes, but many of the pilots had a lot of kids in their families. I don't know if they just went out and had a flight, had another kid, have another flight, another kid. It's amazing the large families that they had. Now, strapped to the mothership's wing, McKay heads for launch altitude on the morning of 9 November 1962. Things did not go so well, as I read to you in that excerpt from chapter 5 at the beginning of this talk. This is the aftermath of what that accident looked like. You can see the shadow of the H-21 helicopter hovering above the crippled and upside down X-15 number 2. McKay has already been dug out and is on his way to the hospital. Operations engineer Bill Albrecht told me, Jack McKay saved his own life that day. As soon as he saw it was going to tumble over, he jettisoned that canopy. He was smart enough to think, if I go over and I'm not breathing air, by the time they get here to rescue me, I'll be dead. Now you can see the massive damage to the X-15. Who would not expect this to be a total loss? It's amazing that McKay even survived. Albrecht told me, my first view of it was from the window of the C-47 Goonie Bird, which took a bunch of us up to Mud Lake. When I saw that thing upside down, I said, that's the end of that airplane. But a steel airplane, that's something else. It's tough stuff. You know, consider most aircraft are made out of lightweight aluminum, but the X-15 was made out of a nickel alloy steel called Inconel X. It was very heavy, but it was also very strong. And although severely injured, McKay returned to the program and accomplished 22 more X-15 research flights, although he did experience 2 more emergency landings before finally leaving the program in September of 1966. You can see here he went off the edge of the lake bed at Delamar Dry Lake, and making sure that if something happened where he rolled over again, note that the canopy has been popped off again, but luckily everybody stayed upright in this case. Now, McKay was a family man with those 8 children I mentioned. He's seen here with 2 of them up at Red Rock Canyon. In the end, the injuries shortened his life, and he died in 1975, 13 years after that accident. His daughter Sherry told me, most of the time when there's an accident with a test pilot, they are killed outright. They aren't hanging around in the halls at Edwards as a reminder of what might happen to them. I think my father felt alienated from everyone and everything, and he was in a tremendous amount of pain. Now, Bob Rushworth was up next, and he became the most successful X-15 pilot of the 12, accomplishing 34 flights in less than 6 years. Paul Bickle, the head of the X-15 program, related to me that Bob White ran into his office one morning and said of Rushworth, "He's not motivated enough. We asked if he wanted to get on the X-15 program, and can you believe he said he had to think about it? And he had to think about it for a week. And he even had to go home and ask his wife." Unbelievable. Now, John Perry, the engineer in charge of the X-15 flight simulator, related to me that it was not a good idea for Bob White to get on Bickle's bad side. If we misjudged something, Bickle was not at all reluctant to let you know. So we used to say, if you mess up, you're going to end up in the Bickle barrel. Now, as you can see by this photo, the F-104 and X-15 are very similar in shape and size. The F-104 was the perfect way for X-15 pilots to practice their landings, something that Rushworth and all of the pilots did hundreds of times during the program. And except for that one landing accident at Mud Lake, there was never another accident during the landing phase of the program. And after the McKay accident in 1962, remember that mangled mess you just saw the pictures of? This is what that tough steel airplane looked like just 18 months later, after North American Aviation rebuilt it into what is now called the X-15A2. It was actually 29 inches longer. And of course, most notably, they added 2 external tanks to the vehicle. The internal fuel with the X-15 achieved about 90 seconds of thrust. After that, it was a ballistic trajectory, a glide flight for the rest of the way. Adding these tanks extended that burn time by another 60 seconds. They were looking to shoot for up to Mach 8 with this vehicle if they could get that performance out of the aircraft. So with those external tanks in place, this is what the updated version looked like in flight. They were really going to push the envelope of what the X-15 was capable of doing, but would they ever reach all the way to Mach 8? Like the solid rocket boosters on the Space Shuttle, the tanks would be jettisoned at Mach 2. On Rushworth's final flight, it was the first using the full fuel tanks. El Cheapo transducers, as flight planner Johnny Armstrong told me, misread the fuel flow and the tanks were erroneously jettisoned. Another emergency landing back into Mud Lake. And here we are in the middle of the program, another little group shot. This is just about the time that Joe Walker left the program. He's seen there with the new prime pilot Jack McKay for NASA. And also Milt Thompson is now his backup at NASA. And then you've got Bob Rushworth, who's now prime pilot for the X-15 for the Air Force, and his backup, Joe Engle. And really proud to let you know that Joe Engle is also the person who wrote the foreword for my book. He was just an absolutely amazing guy. He was the last of the X-15 pilots to pass away. We just lost him back in July. I'm actually going to be there in March for his memorial service in Washington, D.C. at Arlington National Cemetery. And it was a great loss when the final pilot of the program was gone. Not shown in that photograph, who was part of the program at the time, was Neil Armstrong, who became the 7th X-15 pilot. I always love this photo. He looks like he's, what, 12 years old? Is this Daddy Take Me to Work Day or something? It was so tragic when we lost him back in 2012. Here's Armstrong with a couple of X-15 engineers, John McTeague and Elmore Adkins. You can see the X-15 there in the upper right. That's the shape of the nose of the X-15. The nose wheel of the X-15 is hanging down there behind Neil's head. This is all attached to the B-52, the pylon, and getting ready for flight. It was a heck of a program to be involved with and took a lot of work by all these people. And here's Neil leaving the suiting van and heading out to the rocket plane and finally ready to drop. Roger Barnicky, who worked on the life support systems, in other words, he was responsible for that pressure suit that kept Neil and the rest of the guys alive. He said, I watched them get ready for a flight and come back and just have the biggest grin on their faces. They were doing something they loved, and it really showed just how much they enjoyed flying. This was their life. There wasn't one of them that didn't give me that impression. But what if something screwed up in the airplane, I asked him, and that it was the pilot's fault? Well, then they were kind of quiet, but they did not hide things. That was dangerous. And contrary to what you might think, Neil screwed up on several occasions while on the X-15 program, almost getting himself fired by Paul Bickle, such as a flight where he skipped back up out of the atmosphere in the X-15, or almost crashing his F-104 while checking out a dry lake bed for an upcoming X-15 flight because he wasn't judging his altitude correctly. Paul Bickle described this scene to me. Neil realized what he'd done, so he firewalled that F-104. But while the engine was picking up speed, the ship kept getting lower and lower. He dragged one of the tip tanks off and dragged the ventral off the tail, which released the arrestor hook back there. It also tore out one of the hydraulic systems, and the radio antenna disappeared, which left him without any radio, only emergency hydraulics and red lights flashing all over the place. Now, if you know the F-104, the wheels come out from the center outward. And in this case, they're measuring to see how far those wheels were being pushed back up into the fuselage. Continuing, Paul Bickle said he knew he had problems, but he didn't know exactly what. So he figured he'd make a flaps up landing at Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas. But this hook is hanging out the back. He snagged the arresting chain across the approach end of the runway at 220 knots, just tore the chain right out of the runway. His airplane went down the runway, dragging all this junk, and blew out the tires. Nellis was tied up for 3 hours just getting the runway cleared off. Then Milt Thompson was sent up from Edwards, goes up in a two-place F-104B in order to bring Neil back down home, and he overshot the runway, blew his tires off, and tied the whole thing up again. The aerodrome officer called me and said, Paul, please, you guys, don't send any more of your airplanes and pilots up here. We'll load all your guys into one of ours and bring them back to you. It was a disgraceful display all around. After that, Neil left for the astronaut office in Houston, and the rest is history. Now, early in Joe Ingles' career, he got to serve as a docent during a visit from Vice President Hubert Humphrey. I was the new guy on the program, and Bob Rushworth, my boss, says, you're going to go down to the hangar and stand by the X-15. Just stand there. You won't have to say anything. Well, Humphrey came up and he says, well, what have we here? Scared the hell out of me. I didn't know how to talk to a guy like that. But Joe recovered quickly, replying to Humphrey, it's the X-15, sir. The vice president thought a moment, then said, oh, yes, yes. Now, how many squadrons of these do we have? Ingle wasn't quite sure what to say, but he replied, not very many, sir. Humphrey said, well, we obviously need more of these. I'll fix that when I get back to Washington. Ingle went on to fly 3 astronaut qualification flights in the X-15, seeing the Earth from more than 280,000 feet above the Southwest, as seen here. This shot shows at the bottom center is the city of Las Vegas, Nevada, and reaching up off to the upper left is Lake Mead. It was a heck of a view from the altitudes these guys were flying. And here's a dramatic reentry from suborbital space. You'll notice through this presentation, there have been several images of the X-15, which of course are not photographs. These were all created by a guy named Tommy Eriksson from Gothenburg, Sweden. He contacted me at one time and we ended up working together for over 6 years, creating these images to show the X-15 as it's never been shown before in areas where it could not be photographed. And he just did an amazing job. And I have to point out that after the book came out, Tommy used the work that he did in creating these images to work for his PhD thesis, which he handily won. So I'm very proud of the fact that my book also created a brand new doctor in the world. Tommy is just an excellent, excellent instructor. Now, many others were excited about the X-15, even as astronauts prepared to fly to the moon. Wernher von Braun, the architect of Apollo, wanted to know what it would be like to fly in a winged aircraft to space. And how about Miss Edwards, 1962, Wanda Capps gets a lift from the X-15 wing. Or the cast and crew from the TV show Star Trek who beamed down to check out the real deal. Now, the X-15 is often considered a man's program, but it should never be forgotten that many women worked on it as well. They were called computers, and they took all the data and plotted it out for the engineers using calculators, paper, and pens. Without the women, the X-15 data meant absolutely nothing. Like Neil, Joe left for Houston and was initially assigned as the lunar module pilot for Apollo 17, the 6th lunar landing. And after getting bumped from Apollo, you'd think that somebody might just be fed up and leave, but he stuck with the program for many more years. And Joe finally flew 2 more missions into space, commanding the Space Shuttle, STS-2 in 1981 and STS-51I in 1985. Joe was the only astronaut who had earned his astronaut wings prior to going into orbit with his 3 X-15 qualification flights. Now, Milt Thompson was a man who was torn between 2 flight test programs, and he also got to be NASA's technical advisor on the very first movie ever filmed in outer space. Here's the movie poster. Hollywood would never lie to you, right? Actually filmed in space. Milt recalled being involved for approximately 3 months. I think they were here on site probably a couple months, and after that we went down and spent a month in Hollywood during the cutting process. I, of course, asked if he had any input on how to make the film better. Oh yeah, a lot of stuff. It was completely wrong on many things. They really didn't understand airplanes at all. The guy that wrote the script had apparently never even been around an airplane. Charles Bronson is an X-15 pilot, seen here with the real pilot, Bob White, and Mary Tyler Moore in her very first big screen debut. She shows off her proper fashion sense with a nice dress and high heels walking around on the desert near research aircraft. But the hype did not end there. Here's a couple of scenes from a movie called Battle in Outer Space, where those squadrons of X-15s that Hubert Humphrey ordered got put into service battling aliens. Gantry launched, silo launched, silver X-15s with red racing stripes. I love these things. And what X-15 would not be complete without a death ray in its nose? People forget how popular the X-15 was at the time. It was used to advertise a company's participation in the high-flying program, or maybe just get your attention by calling your product the Kodak Instamatic X-15. And besides film and advertising, there were many books, including the fictional adventures for young readers of Mike Mars. There were 8 books in this series, and 2 of the books dealt with the X-15. Mike Mars flies the X-15, and Mike Mars, South Pole spaceman. They actually took the X-15 down to Antarctica to fly up from the pole to launch a polar orbiting satellite using the X-15 as the second stage on that program. And he saved the X-15 from the pesky Russians that were trying to get all of its secret. It was pretty amazing. And I'm also very proud of the fact I took that book with me on my first trip down to Antarctica in 2023. I actually just got back 4 weeks ago from my second trip to Antarctica. And I was able to give my talk about the X-15 while I was there, which was pretty amazing. Now, here's a really cool X-15 runaround friction toy that showed up on eBay. May not be super accurate on the way it looks, but it's still a pretty cool thing to have. But even though I'm very OCD about the X-15, I didn't get this one. This went for over $900 on eBay many years ago. This was sold, I think, about 15 years ago. And in 2006, the post office issued 2 X-15 stamps, which also happened to be holograms. This is the cheap one, $4.05. The other one was $14.95. It's not something where collectors would be going out and buying sheets of these. And sorry, we don't have our 3D glasses to see the hologram effect, but they're really, really cool stamps. After 14 flights and that chance at Hollywood, Thompson finished on the X-15. He told me it was busy on the altitude flights. I really only got the chance to look out the window once, and that was my last flight. I got up on top after I had everything fairly well settled. Then I looked out the window. Gee, it was a really impressive view. You could see all the way from San Francisco to Baja, California. It was beautiful up there, but you just have a few precious seconds to take a look. Now, Milt was the first to fly the lifting body type, and he had to make the choice of one program over the other. His boss, Paul Bickle, came on and said, "You got too much on your plate. You got to go with one or the other." And contrary to what you might think, he went with the lifting body program over the X-15. Now, Pete Knight was about to become the fastest man alive. His program was the X-15A2 with those external tanks that he inherited from Bob Rushworth when he retired from the program. Pete made 16 flights on the X-15. One of them is considered the most famous, while another was probably one of the most dangerous. The program built up speed, testing out the capability using those external tanks. And one primary purpose of the high-speed flights was to test a supersonic combustion ramjet engine, a scramjet, as seen here, attached to the bottom tail of the X-15. But after years of work, it never came to fruition and has only recently been tested using unmanned vehicles at hypersonic velocity. Now, before continuing with the A2 program, on a routine flight in aircraft number 1, Pete launched, and soon afterward, all electrical power in the rocket plane died. No one knew where he was, or even if he was alive. Knight told me, "I was a little over Mach 4, and the airplane was wallowing around. I still had reaction jets, so I maintained some control. At one time, I was up over 70 degrees of bank angle, and I looked down and I saw Mono Lake. And I told myself, you better enjoy that view because that's the last one you're going to see. My thoughts were this was going to hurt regardless of what I did. If I bailed out, I was over Mach 4, and that's the limit on that ejection seat. So I thought, well, I'll stay with it. I'll see what happens. I'll see how long I can control it. Once I lose it, well, then I'll have to bail out." As the aircraft went over the top, I started an auxiliary power unit, and that gave me hydraulics to control the reentry. I didn't have any instruments, and there were no lights in the cockpit. As I entered the atmosphere, I turned around and pulled about 6 Gs in order to get back to Mud Lake. I didn't have any flaps. All I had was airspeed and altitude once I went subsonic. Now you have to understand this high range corridor has this whole series of dry lake beds. So there was plenty of places to land during an emergency on the X-15 program. But the flights are each programmed to say, you're going to launch near this dry lake, and up to a certain point in the mission, you can go to the next lake, until you can finally make it all the way down to Edwards. The electrical failure occurred right at the break point between two of the emergency lakes. Everybody at NASA assumed as long as he was still alive, he would probably keep trying to fly forward and land at the next lake. But he didn't like that lake, so he had turned around to go back to Mud. So nobody at Edwards was even looking for him in the right location. He did land safely at Mud Dry Lake, but they were looking for him down at Grapevine Lake, but he didn't like that place at all. One of the other X-15 pilots, Bill Dana, eventually figured out, gee, I know I hate Grapevine. I bet Pete does too. Maybe we should go back and check Mud, and that's where they found him. Once they arrived, Pete was flown back to Edwards, and the X-15 was made ready for yet another convoy back to base. Now, made to protect the X-15A2 and its pilots at speeds of up to Mach 8, they knew the Inconel X skin would be right at its limits, so they came up with this spray-on ablator that was created by the Martin Company, which would help protect that Inconel X skin from the higher temperatures expected to be experienced at these high speeds. Now, it had the consistency of a pencil eraser, along with the color, as you can see here, but this stuff was oxygen sensitive, meaning that oxygen could soak in, which is something you have around rocket planes. And if something struck that ablative, like if a technician just dropped a wrench or something, that oxygen soaked into the ablative could literally cause an explosion. Not to mention, as Knight explained very emphatically to me, it's pink. I'm not going to fly a pink airplane. So they added a white paint layer on top of the pink, and Pete then felt it was safe to come near the X-15 again. And here's a little portrait of North American Aviation's two white beauties, the XB-70A Valkyrie bomber and the X-15A2 rocket plane, now nicknamed in honor of its pilot as the White Knight. It was 2:31 in the afternoon of 3 October 1967 when Pete dropped away from the B-52 with the fully loaded ablative-covered X-15A2. He leveled off at 102,100 feet and made his speed run, topping out at Mach 6.70 or 4,520 miles per hour. Unbeknownst to him, the aircraft was in peril as shock waves burned through the X-15 skin. You know, look at that dummy scramjet there on the bottom of the X-15. Think about where those shock waves are going. They're going straight up into the engine compartment of the X-15. After landing, the damage was clear. They had almost lost this X-15. This aircraft would never fly again. The last thing you want to have is a blowtorch shockwave going right into an engine compartment. And for surviving that high-speed flight, Knight was awarded the Harmon Trophy by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Bill Dana was the last of the NASA pilots to come onto the program. And the best way to get used to flying at Mach 6 or 300,000 feet was to sit in the hangar and fly what they called the Iron Bird, the X-15 simulator, usually while sitting there drinking a cup of coffee and talking to his colleagues. Here's the look inside the hangar there at Edwards. There were 3 X-15s off on the right, lifting bodies over on the left, along with other experimental aircraft. This is a far cry from the mundane scene in this same hangar today. This is what the hangar looked like when I was a kid going up to Edwards, and this is what got my passion fueled about the X-15 program. And how about an unexplained Band-Aid on Dana's nose the day prior to his first flight? He just refused to tell me what happened. I asked him several times, but I don't know, maybe he got into an altercation with his simulator. He just wouldn't say. By this time in the program, the X-15 carried experiments rather than being the experiment itself. This is one of my favorite images that Tommy created, showing the X-15 in space working. Experiments are deployed, different patches are open to capture things. It's just an amazing image. People don't think of this vehicle as being in space and being able to open up and do these kinds of things. Different experiments they took were things like solar spectrum, missile launch signature detection, high altitude balloon deployment, or Bill's favorite, and I say this a bit sarcastically, collecting micrometeorite dust. He said, I remember there was this big meteor shower, and to get out here to Edwards for that early flight, I had to drive to work in the dark. I have never ever seen so many shooting stars in my life. There must have been 1,000 as I came in from Lancaster, and those were the micrometeorites we were going up to try to capture. I always thought what a classically dumb idea it was in the first place. So of course I asked him, well, what are the possibility of capturing one through the X-15 cockpit rather than the experiment out on the left tip pod? Bill stated hopefully, well, I don't suppose it would have hurt us. And he was correct. Bill survived his high altitude experiment flights just fine. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the 12th and final X-15 pilot, Michael J. Adams from the US Air Force. After being accepted as an astronaut in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, he saw the writing was on the wall that they were never going to get this off the launch pad. So he asked for and got accepted for a transfer to the X-15, where he flew 6 successful missions until the morning of 15 November 1967, less than 6 weeks after the high-speed flight of Pete Knight. Launching at 10:30 a.m., Mike headed upward into space, topping out at 266,000 feet, earning him a set of astronaut wings. But electrical problems distracted him. At the top of his arc, he misread an instrument and actually turned the X-15 backwards along its flight path for re-entry. As the air bit into the rocket plane, the orientation sent him into a hypersonic spin, knocking him out. Mike came to long enough to grab the controls, but the aircraft went into a severe up and down porpoising motion that quickly exceeded the structural limits, breaking the aircraft apart. Near Ridgecrest, the remains of X-15 number 3 crashed into the desert at 10:35 a.m., just 5 minutes after he had left the wing of the B-52. Robert White told me, I often felt that sometimes we went too far with these things. When I was participating in the program, your eye was always on the ball. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this as a routine thing. Boy, this is not routine stuff. That NASA is a different NASA than the one that I operated with. A memorial created by Eagle Scout John Badelsky now marks the spot in the desert where Mike Adams lost his life, and it has been greatly expanded over the years. We have visitors coming from all over the world to see this site. It's really amazing, the people that we get out there. After the accident, the X-15 was flown by Knight and Dana 8 more times during the coming year before coming to a close with the final flight on 24 October of 1968. With a total of 199 flights, the hope was to have made it to a nice even 200 before the end of the year. The last of 8 attempts was made on 20 December. With all systems operational, Pete Knight was near the X-15 in the suiting van, ready to board the B-52 takeoff roll. the clouds opened up with a freak snowstorm in the middle of the Mojave Desert. Paul Bickle came over the net and he said, "We're aborting this flight. Somebody is trying to tell us something." The X-15 program was officially completed. The number one X-15 was shipped off to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and number two went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Here, 7 of the pilots celebrate the X-15 at the Smithsonian soon after it arrived. The X-15 created 8 new astronauts, 5 from the Air Force and 3 from NASA. The Air Force took care of their own at the time this happened, but it took until 2005 for NASA to finally recognize the achievements of Walker, McKay, and Dana. And Bill Dana was the only one still left alive to receive his wings that day. What could have come next? A possible Delta wing variant, but that disappeared after the Adams accident since the number 3 aircraft had been slated for the program. Or maybe a scramjet powered model. This would have been the true follow-on to the X-15, something which has never materialized in the more than half a century since the program was completed. No manned X-planes may ever again achieve what the X-15 accomplished. No more testing our limits, no new frontiers to achieve. I hope that maybe the story of the X-15 and the people who made it happen may instead inspire a new generation to take flight in a quest for the unknown. The pilots of the X-15 and I bid you a farewell and a good morning. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'll be glad to answer any questions you have about the X-15 or the people involved in the program. And with that, I will turn it back over to your moderator. Let me go out of screen share, and there we are. So thank you so much again. I appreciate the invite. I hope that everybody enjoyed the program. And if you have any questions, please let me know what you have.
Oh, that was fantastic. So
Well,
much
thank you,
fun.
Dave.
Yeah, so much fun to catch all that history.
It was truly an amazing program, that's for sure. And I was just honored to be able to be the person to record the voices of these people. So many of the people that I spoke with are now long gone, and they're just never going to be having their opportunity to speak about it anymore. So I'm really, really glad to be able to do what I've been able to do. And traveling the world, doing my talks and stuff has been just an amazing experience. And I can't say enough how much the X-15 is, it guides my life nowadays. It took me 30 years of work to do the book itself, and it's been out now for almost 12 years, and the adventure continues.
Well, and thank you for actually doing for all this effort to collect information, evidence that and capture that as because of the factual, historical, objective evidence. And as you said, that people are unfortunately for a blink of a time moment on Earth, but the lasting impression that they leave, and a lot of them are, if not captured, then it will also leave with their passing. So thanks to your efforts and the other historians that I know that NASA has a rich historical preservation effort as well. This both the capturing recordings and narratives and so on. So this is fascinating. And what is as listening to your presentation, what I was thinking that you have to be a certain type of person that like test pilots. So they are continuing flying even after experiencing accidents and under such a stressful circumstances, and still determined to step in, sit down, strapped, and take another flight. But because of their efforts we know more, we expand our boundaries, and then there's, as you stated, a consequence from X-15 was one of the consequences was the shuttle and other advances in technology. So again, fascinating.
Well,
I
thank you.
see that we have a few questions, and so Esther posted, if was the advanced X-15 made of the same materials used to construct the old X-15?
Yeah, as I say, the X-15, the basic body of the X-15 was still intact after that rollover accident. So yes, the vehicle was still made out of that Inconel X nickel alloy, and yeah, but they did expand it because they needed to put in more hardware to support those external tanks and stuff. So it was a distinctive aircraft of its own. As I say, it was 29 inches longer than the original version. But yeah, all the materials were still the same.
Okay, thank you. Rock posted another question related specifically to a landing gear. Why have they opted for skids instead of wheels as the aft landing gear?
Yeah, that's the skids were very unique for a research aircraft like this, and they were located all the way at the rear, and they just were folded up against the fuselage. They weren't even in housings or anything. And the primary reason for the skids was because they could save a heck of a lot of weight over a traditional landing gear. So that's what led them to use the skids in the first place. But it also created an interesting situation during landing, because when you come in and touch down with those skids at the back of the aircraft, there's absolutely nothing in the world that you can do to hold the nose off at that time. It's like trying to balance a pencil just by the end of the pencil, you know. Most landing gear is placed at the center of gravity, and this, of course, is at the rear of the aircraft, far from that center of gravity. So the nose gear had to be very beefy in order to accept the knock that it got when it slammed down to the lake bed. That's one of the reasons why on that third powered flight, the X-15 broke in half, was because the nose gear was not yet beefed up enough. And that's one of the things they discovered from that flight, was they had to do some changes to that gear. But that's the reason. It was because of weight. That was the sole reason they went that way.
Thank you. So a couple of comments that Zafar, I think he already left, but he also thanked for your presentation. And we all join in that, thanking you for appearing here and presenting.
Well, thank
again,
you.
fascinating. Cindy had posted that couple posts, comments that she worked with Royce Beauty at Rockwell International on the Space Shuttle program. Royce told her stories about X-15 reaction control system, which he worked on. It used hydrogen peroxide over a silver screen catalyst. I guess it's not Cindy, it's Tom posted. They're together and on the same account. And had the pleasure of talking with Scott Crossfield under the wing of B-52 carrier aircraft at Edwards Air Force Base during an open house. So thank you for posting this. And if there's no other questions, I have a few questions, both related to X-15 program, and you may or may not be able to answer all of that, but
Sure.
I thought, since I prepared, why not? So in your research and interaction with all the X-15 program participants, was there communicated to you that what were some of the biggest challenges that the team that worked on faced in developing and flying X-15?
Oh, the biggest development hurdle. I think it's just trying to figure out how to do this for a hypersonic vehicle. There would, never been a hypersonic vehicle designed and built and flown before. And so trying to go through that learning curve of saying exactly what do we need? We need to have the trade-off between strength versus the weight and things like that. An example is that in the original design of the X-15, the tail, you noticed how the tail was a very, very sharp leading edge, and then it went back to a very blunt rear on it. And the design originally was more of this diamond shape where you had the very sharp leading edge, but then it also had a rear sharp leading edge that went back at an angle as well. So it sort of gave the impression of a traditional airfoil when you looked at it overall. And in the end, they found out that at hypersonic velocities, it really doesn't matter what's behind the forward facing angle on that. And that's why they were able to just chop that off straight. They didn't need that back part of the airfoil in place. And so they could save a lot of weight by getting rid of that. And you could also see, if you noticed on some of the photos, the rear of that aircraft, it didn't even almost look finished. What they had was like a corrugated metal that was in the back of the fuselage, the back of the upper and vertical and lower vertical stabilizers, because again, that was just there for strength. They didn't care as much about aesthetics at that point. So it sort of had the look of a boilerplate at that point. So it was very interesting to go through those kind of things. They also had to make sure that they left gaps in some of the seams of the aircraft so that it could expand during the high heat portions of the flight. This vehicle experienced about 1,350 degrees, which is extremely hot. And so again, those are the kind of things that they needed. And of course, with the scramjet, they also learned their lessons on what happens with shock waves on the vehicle at that kind of speeds as well. So yeah, they learned a lot of different lessons on this X-15, and it really helped out with future programs.
And I think related to what you just mentioned, that with the experiencing high heat, Daniel Hayes posted that did they have a special compound of rubber for the nose wheel to keep it from melting due to heating?
No, not really at all. And in fact, that did cause some problems at times. The nose wheel was protected because it was up in its own wheel well, and the Inconel X skin would keep the heat away from the wheel, the tires, so they didn't have to worry about it melting. However, within the door that covered the nose wheel well, there was what was called a ram door. And what that was that it was a little door that would release when you got near landing, and it would accept the ram air that would help pull the rest of the door open and allow the wheel to drop. And there were several times during the flights when that ram air door on the wheel well popped open at times when it was not supposed to pop open, such as around Mach 4.2 or so, where you still have a lot of heat on that aircraft, which then was being directed right straight into the nose wheel. And it did, in fact, melt the wheels right off of the vehicle. The tire was completely gone, just leaving the rim. And there were a couple of times when the X-15 landed with no nose wheel, and amazingly, it survived without any problem. But it's pretty amazing to see that nose wheel just completely with the tire gone from it, and to think that they came through and landed that way. So no, there was nothing special. It was just a high pressure rubber tire that was on there.
And Rock posted another question. How long before the takeoff have pilots ingressed the X-15, and how long did it take for the carrier to reach release altitude?
Yeah, the pilots would go into the suiting van and be all suited up, and then they would get into the X-15. They would, especially during the summer months, they wanted to spend as little time as possible in the cockpit of the X-15 before the B-52 took off. There were unfortunately times when that did not happen, and they spent sometimes hours sitting on the tarmac as they were trying to get ready to go and finding out that there were little systems failures. And I know Scotty got really, really ticked about that one time where he was just burning up inside that cockpit. And they finally had to get him out. And it wasn't even a technical issue in the end that aborted the flight. It was simply the pilot was too far gone to be able to continue the flight himself. But the typical time they tried to keep it down to, especially after those hot incidences, where they were trying to keep it to no more than about 15 minutes after you ingress the cockpit before the B-52 would start its takeoff roll. So, and then once it did take off, it usually took about an hour, maybe up to 90 minutes or so, but usually around an hour to get up to launch altitude and the launch location, because again, they had to traverse the territory to get to the right place along the high range track in order to properly have their track for their flight that was planned. The X-15, the whole corridor was about 400 miles long, but the X-15 itself, from the time that it dropped to the time it got to Edwards, the furthest it traveled was right about 300 miles, which is still pretty impressive for 10 minutes of flight.
True. Cindy and Tom, I guess, posted that how was the X-15 APU, probably avionics power unit, powered? And I was an APU design engineer on the Space Shuttle program. Is that correct? APU stands for avionics power unit, or
Auxiliary.
Auxiliary power unit. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the APU, there were two APUs on the X-15, and it was interesting. They had some difficulties with the APU in the fact that early in the program, there was never an APU failure. And then all of a sudden, they started having failure after failure after failure of the APU. And it took a lot of figuring out to understand what the heck was going on. And what they eventually found out was that early in the program, they had this oil, which was just like off the shelf at your local automotive parts place, that they put into the APU to keep everything lubricated. And then later on, somebody came up with the idea that, oh, we should probably be using like mil-spec oil to make sure that we're not getting anything that's too messy and full of crud and everything. And so they replaced it with this nice clean oil. And all of a sudden they were getting failures because the oil was actually too clean. What they found out was that the crud in this off-the-shelf oil would seal things up so that at altitude, it was still a sealed unit and was performing properly. So it's pretty interesting. They actually needed a dirtier oil in order to keep that thing working correctly. So that was one very interesting thing that they learned. Yeah, the X-15 was done in a whole different era. It was one of my favorite parts was some of the talks that I had with these people about how differently the X-15 program was run at the time than what you had running today, that they would not be allowed to get away with a lot of the things that they did on this program. Yeah, so it was just great what they were able to pull off, just because They just go in there and say, oh, well, we need to change something. We're going to change it. Nowadays, you'd have to run through the paperwork through 1,500 different people and get the design changes, and it would take you several months and what have you. And they just went out and just did it. So it was really great from that standpoint.
Okay, it actually flows into another good question that both I had prepared and Tom, Brian. So I will give the ownership to this question to Tom. What were some of the, I guess, biggest lesson learned from X-15 that influenced future programs and specifically perhaps design and development of the space shuttle?
Well, there's a couple of things there. One is that the X-15 really made possible the flight of Apollo to the moon. And that's something a lot of people don't understand. On a normal aircraft, you usually, at the time, used to have like a long tube that would come out of the nose of the vehicle that had these instruments on there that would give attitude and speed and things like that. And on the X-15, they couldn't do that because at the speeds they were going to fly, that tube would just melt away. So they developed this thing called the cue ball. And so you'll notice on the nose of the X-15 that there was this bright silver ball that was on the front, and it served the same purpose as all the instruments on that nose boom. And there were like holes drilled in certain places on that cue ball that would sense the airflow and the pressure, the air pressure, things like that. That cue ball, once developed for the X-15, was transferred directly to the Apollo program and was used on both the nose of the launch escape system on the Saturn 1B and the Saturn V. And so that was at the very tip top of both of those rockets, and are the reason that the Saturn 1B and Saturn V was able to find its way into space because it had that cue ball sensor that was developed for the X-15. The other biggest thing that came out of the program was that, well, it really made the space shuttle program possible. If you go back to the early designs of the space shuttle, they were looking at actually putting these giant jet engines in pods on the space shuttle. And so they would do their mission, they'd fly into space, they'd be on orbit, and then they'd come back through reentry. And the plan originally had been that once you finished reentry, then these doors would open up and these giant pods would plop out, and you'd have jet engines that they had to spool up so that they could then fly around and choose their landing place. And Paul Bickle at the X-15 program saw this stuff going on and said, this is just insanity to put these jet engines on there and to be, beholden to those engines to get you safely on the ground. So he packed up X-15 pilot Milt Thompson and sent him to Johnson Space Center for a couple of weeks, where he talked to NASA and proved to them that one of the great things that the X-15 did was that it flew into space and it was able to fly back from space completely unpowered for those pinpoint landings, those martini touchdowns that Bob White loves so much. And so they could do these pinpoint landings coming back from space, and they didn't need those engines. And there was a lot of resistance at first at NASA, but they eventually finally came around and understood that that's the way it had to be done. And they threw out those engines. And could you imagine the extra weight and stuff that that would have created on the space shuttle? It would have cut down on the payload. The whole performance of the system would have been very, very much curtailed over what we were able to get. So the X-15 was really responsible for that. And on top of that, Joe Engle, of course, being an X-15 pilot and then later a pilot on the Space Shuttle program, out of 135 missions of the Space Shuttle, Joe Engle on STS-2 was the only pilot ever in the program who was allowed to fly the space shuttle fully under manual control from re-entry burn through landing at Edwards Air Force Base, because he'd already come back from space in the X-15 and knew how to do that. So it was a very great accomplishment.
Indeed, indeed. Dave was asking, what was the typical launch altitude for X-15?
Yeah, the B-52 would usually shoot for around 45,000 feet. That was their basic launch altitude. That was the first stage, so to speak, of the X-15 mission before it was dropped away to power on its own. So yeah, it was usually around 45,000 feet.
Okay,
Well,
there's
I just, if I could
Yeah,
jump
go
in
ahead.
really quickly, I just want to say how much I appreciate the presentation because, back in high school, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I wanted to fly F-16s and the SR-71 and the X-15, and all of that just fascinated me. And then when I learned that I needed perfect eyesight to do so, that's when the military lost me. So, but ever since, and with the right stuff and so on, it's been a phenomenal story to actually hear from you more of the details and the accuracy and so forth. It's just fascinating, and I can't wait to get my hands on your book. So I really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. I appreciate that. And I love your room, by the way. I love the telescopes and stuff. It looks like a great place to live.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I will tell you, for anybody who does get the book, I want to throw in a little thing here. Make sure that you go to the top of the list of illustrations page, where you will find the web address to my website, to the X-15 index page. Within the book, there's only room for like 45 photographs. You go to my index page and you'll find links for over 3,000 photographs. They're tied to the different chapters, tied to the different people. There's PDF downloads that you can have there that'll give you the flight log of the X-15. I actually created a tour itinerary that you can follow in the footsteps of the X-15. So anyway, I just want to let you know, be sure to go there and check it out. And you'll also find my contact information. And if you read my book, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you so much.
Well, I have a comment also, and I agree with Charles. When I was a kid, I loved to follow the X-15 and all the research aircraft that the Air Force and the NASA was doing. And my brother Bob and I were space cadets going through early years, and we loved the X-15 because it was an active aircraft. When you came down from space, you could fly it. We didn't like the capsules strategy because it was a passive vehicle, and you just had to plunk down wherever you landed. And so we thought the X-15 was the future and the best kind of aircraft to go into space. And by the way, I have a picture of the X-15, and it shows this flap on this flap door that was used to open the door.
There you
And,
go. That's the ram air door.
Yeah, so you can see that door, and also the nose, the ball. If you see it real up close, you can see the ball on the nose part. And by the way, this picture was in a wastebasket at one time. I went to work for North American Aviation in 1966 in a research area, and I didn't work on the X-15 or any aircraft, but I was next to a section that did. And at one time they had a big layoff. A lot of people were leaving, and so this one guy just had pictures on his wall, and he just threw a ball in the wastebasket. And I walked by and I said, "Are you throwing the picture of the X-15 away? You can't do that. That's history." So he says, "If you want it, you can have it." So I pulled it out of the wastebasket along with a couple of others. I think the B-70 was in there too. And so I have it hanging on my wall now as a picture that shows the advanced X-15. And
Well, thank you for helping save those things. I mean, that's one of the things that I've been very lucky to be able to do, is I've saved a lot of stuff that I know was headed for the trash.
Yeah.
I went to the North American photo archives early on in my research, and I was able to pull out just tons and tons of photographs there. And I know that less than a year after I did that, those photo archives were gone completely. And so the stuff that I got out of there was saved from that trash heap. It was just terrible. And it's really interesting because I get people from all over the world contact me all the time about the X-15, and it's really cool to do this. And I've got people sharing photographs and things. I can't believe that after it's been more than 40 years since I started on this project now, and I'm still finding new photographs of the X-15. People are sending me stuff. It's just amazing. And so being the archive for that is something very special to me, and I take it very seriously that this stuff needs to be preserved. So thank you for your part on that, and hopefully I'm doing my job as well.
And thank you for doing what you're doing, because that's history that needs to be preserved. And I think in the years to come, it'll be higher and higher value. I had one question though on your talk. You said on that flight that the astronaut landed on a lake that they didn't expect him to land on when he turned around and flew back to a better landing site. And then they looked for him at the forward landing site, couldn't find him. Now, didn't they have radio contact at that time, or what happened to the radio?
No, remember that was a flight where he lost all his electrical power, so he had no radio.
Okay.
He had no way to contact him, right?
Okay.
And the transponder on board the aircraft was dead, so they couldn't track it as well, things like that. So, yeah. So it was just literally the other pilot, Bill Dana, that said, "Oh yeah, I hate that lake too. So I bet he's gonna go somewhere else," and that's how they found him.
Yeah. Well, those guys had the right stuff, and even more than the right stuff. And I'm wondering if our society is producing that kind of person today. So it's a question.
Yeah, yeah, it is a good question. Unfortunately, it was a completely different era, and they just handled things so differently than we do nowadays. We have this fear of failure today. It's like we don't want to do anything unless we know 100% for sure that we're going to succeed before we even start. And that's really not the way to go into anything. We don't know if we're going to succeed if we don't even try. And that was the mantra of the X-15 was, let's just get out there and see what happens and do what we can. And sometimes they messed up on the X-15. You know, it's what caused the accident with Mike Adams and stuff. That was a terrible situation. And it's unfortunate because the lessons that came from the Mike Adams accident never really got learned at NASA as a whole. And you can see a lot of the same lessons not being learned when we ended up with the Challenger accident, and especially not learning those things when we lost the Columbia back in 2003. And there are very, very similar circumstances between all three of those vehicles being lost and all those crews being lost.
Yeah, I have a saying that is responsible for pushing the edge of advancement forward. It's very simple, 4 words: no guts, no glory.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. And as they said in The Right Stuff, they also had similar saying, no Bucks, no Buck Rogers.
It is a quite complex and challenge, and not always moving forward is the right answer, regardless of the outcome. So
Right.
that's that there. It has to be a balance, and that's why in many organizations there's the safety review board and different kind of readiness reviews. So then it's at least the loss of the, whether it's a article under test, item that is flying, or a human life is minimized. And when you talk about the losses and or the impacts from loss and negative impact from some of the failures in X-15 program, the bigger program, the bigger impact, the bigger outcome in the case of a failure, and especially when you have multiple entities, international partners. So that it's the who do you report to and who do you defend your actions? Is it the panel of the Air Force, or it's a panel of the all American people, or it's a panel of all people in so many countries? So that's it depends on the funding, it depends on the responsibilities are, and it's a balancing act, and I do not envy those that make decision go no go, whether it was during a Challenger accident or pre-accident or any other programs that very high stake decisions have to be made. So I would not want to minimize the efforts of engineers, researchers, and that work on various programs. All of them contribute in various ways, and so this is. I wouldn't say that we lost the ability for endeavor and exploration. It's more of the stakes are extremely high, and there's a lot of parallels are being driven between commercially run versus public entity as such as NASA, the government run programs, and there's different responsibilities, different ownerships, and different answers have to be made. The Congress is not calling on the CEO of SpaceX, for instance, for some of the results of their launches, but Congress would call for and did call for the results of the Columbia and the accidents. So that just would be my comment, that we need to be a little bit more attuned to what's at stake. Other than that, I think everyone that is involved in space program is taking a lot of risks. The launches and the space exploration is, even though it sounds like we have for over 30 years presence in space, continuous presence in space, but it's never routine. It's not mundane. It's always, there's always risks involved. And with that said, I admire people that taking a step and stepping into a launch vehicle, and whether it was a X-15 or continues with other launches that we are making right now, and continuing contribution into space exploration. With this said, I wanted to ask is that what inspired you to focus on human side of X-15 story?
Great question. Well, as I say, the X-15 has fascinated me since I was a little kid. That's why I decided to use this as the basis for my book. And but the thing was too that there are many books out there. Well, not many, but there's a bunch of books out there on the X-15 that have really wanted to focus on the technical aspects of the program and things. And that's not to say that those things are not in my book as well, but they are told for a general audience. They're not told for an engineering audience. And that was the other deal, was that I said that the part that's never been touched before is the human aspect. You know, who were the people who put this all together? And it was one of the huge breakthroughs for me in the work on this book, was trying to figure out, you know, I had some of these interviews under my belt, and I was trying to figure out where to go with this and how I was going to put it together. And when I was focused by the publisher itself, you know, where I had to write my book proposal, and that got me focused on saying, how am I actually going to write this book? How is it going to be organized? And it finally really hit me that, because of this unique aspect of what I had, which were those interviews that nobody else had, none of these other people had ever done any interviews. And I said, okay, well, this is definitely going to be focused on the people. And the way that I laid it out is that there were 12 X-15 pilots. So it just dawned on me that that's the structure of the book right there. So you find in the book that there are 12 pilots and there are 12 primary chapters. And what it is each one of the chapters is the focus of one of those pilots. And it talks about their whole life, but the emphasis, of course, is during their time on the X-15 and what the effect was of their time on the X-15. And so it was really amazing to be able to have that breakthrough, and it's sort of when everything fell into place. And but it's also one of the reasons it took me so long to do this, because it had been very easy to locate people like the pilots who were still alive, people like Paul Bickle, who headed the program, other of the managers and things like that. But I knew that I still didn't have the whole story. And it wasn't until the dedication of the Mike Adams Monument back in 2004, and I was out there that day, and that was the day when I first connected with the guys in the trenches, the people that you don't know the names of, the mechanics, the rocket shop guys, people like that. And that all of a sudden, that was my key to being able to finish the book, was to have all of this information from those key players, those people that you don't know the names of, but the aircraft would never get off the ground without them. And that was an amazing thing for me. And it led to, doing 70 interviews to be able to get to this point. And one of the most amazing interviews that I did was soon after that dedication, when I first got into this group of people, was that we sat down with 17 of these guys in one room, in the back room of a restaurant in Lancaster one day, and had this group interview that had to be one of the most fabulous times I ever had, just listening to these guys bouncing off of each other. And also, as they said, to make sure to keep each other honest. And it was just absolutely fabulous to be able to see those stories unfold right there in front of me. And I'm so glad to be able to tell their stories. I had one guy that I interviewed who, his son had said, my dad is not doing well. He's got Alzheimer's and stuff, but if you'd like to come up and talk to him and see if you can pick his brain a bit about the X-15, come on up. And I did. And afterwards, the son told me he had not seen his father so animated in years and so lucid in many years. And to be able to get those stories from him. And 2 weeks after I did that interview, he was gone. And so it's been such an honor to be able to tell all these different stories. And I'm so glad I'm able to do it from the personal side. I get across all the technical information too, but it is the personal side that makes it all happen. And my book is part of what's called the Outward Odyssey series, which is subtitled The People's History of Spaceflight. And it's one of the reasons my book is part of that, is because I'm focusing on the human aspect, as they do in the other books in this series as well.
Well, I have a question akin to what Svetlana asked, and that is, what was your career, and what kind of jobs did you have for income during those early days?
Well, my career started out in a way that I never expected it to. My dad was an aerospace engineer. He's the reason why I first got interested in the X-15, because he took me along on his missions up to Edwards Air Force Base. That was part of the territory that he had. He had these 16-track tape recorders that were used for recording telemetry and stuff. And so he would be at Edwards, China Lake, places like that. And when I was 5 years old, he said, "Hey, you want to come with me on one of my trips up to Edwards? I think you'd love it up there." And that started my whole passion for the X-15. And it's it then led to this fact that I wanted to eventually write a book. That was my overarching goal in life, was to be able to sit down and write a book. But I also found out when it came that time that I didn't have the money for college. So I ended up going into the Air Force. And I ended up working on missile systems in the Air Force for 8 years, and pretty much became what my dad was, an aerospace engineer. I stayed in the Air Force long enough to finish my degree and went back out into the civilian world and worked in the aerospace industry for the next dozen years or so after that. I did branch out into some other areas. I actually worked for a telescope company at one time, which was pretty cool. That's why I love Charles with his telescope there. And so it took a long time for me to realize that it's like, but I really still want to get back to that core of what I wanted to do, which is write a book. And even then, when I first figured that out, it took me a while to figure out what was I going to write about. And then it finally hit me. It's like, oh yeah, remember you love the X-15, you love writing, so why don't you write a book about the X-15? And 30 years later, the whole thing was finished and it came out, and I still can't believe it's being as well received as it is. It's been just fantastic.
Fascinating, fascinating. Kind of following that, the human element of that of the book is that after talking with so many different contributors, participants, do you think that people involved in X-15 program, what did they feel about its legacy and their contribution to spaceflight?
Well, I think the people who worked on the X-15, they'd all been involved with these research aircraft coming up, some of them back into the X-1 and things like that. And for them, the X-15 was the continuation of what they had been doing for so many years. And all of them expected this to keep going. And it was one of the things that I found when talking to them, that none of them realized at the time that the X-15 program would end up being the zenith of their careers. They always anticipated going on to the next, like the X-20 dinosaur program, things like that. Some of them did go on to work on the Space Shuttle, which was great. But for a lot of them, the X-15 was definitely the pinnacle of what they achieved in their careers. And they couldn't believe that happened. They really couldn't. And it's one of the reasons why so many of them were definitely willing to sit down and talk to me, because they had so many great stories to tell and wanted to get that story out about what had happened on that program. And so I thank them for their time and efforts and stuff on my behalf. And they had such a camaraderie. They had such a sense of family being part of that. I mean, the X-15 really was a family, to the point that even when they were sick, they had to come into work, which caused a lot of havoc because then everybody else would get sick as well. But these people loved going to their work every day. They really, really did. And it made such a point. And they still have people that get together. The few people that are left, they get together for their retirees lunch every month and things like that. So there's still a family even after all these years.
Maybe you have covered this, but if you could choose one key takeaway for people to learn from X-15 program, what would it be?
Well, I think the key thing to realize out of the X-15 program, the big key lesson that I got out of it, talking with these people, was to, dream big about stuff. Say, yeah, we can do this and not be held back by regulations or anything else. Let's do what we have to do to get something up there, and let's try something new. Somebody would come up with this idea. The idea of the X-15 was it had a two-pronged approach when it was first proposed. We want to look at hypersonic flight, which is above Mach 5, and we want to look at high altitude, especially re-entry from space with a controlled vehicle. And so they were looking at this stuff, and they achieved all of the goals of the X-15 within like the first 3 years of the program. And yet the program flew for almost a decade. And so that was one of the great things about the X-15 was, well, gee, we've got this program, we've achieved our goals, what's next? And they were able to come up with all these great ideas of what to do with the X-15 after that. As I mentioned in the program, where the X-15, instead of being the experiment itself, ended up being the carrier of so many other experiments where people came up with these great ideas, and it's like, hey, we have a vehicle that can take us to those parameters in flight, to the heights, to the speeds. And we don't have that today. I mean, the X-15 achieved Mach 6.7. We can barely do Mach 2 with some of the aircraft that we have today. People cannot fly at the speeds that we did with the X-15. And we certainly can't fly at the altitudes unless you're going all the way into space. We don't have anybody that has any kind of a research aircraft that will fly in the same kind of regime that the X-15 was able to accomplish, you know, so many times over its career. So I wish that we would get back and say, gee, maybe we need to be looking at this in different ways. The most they're doing on hypersonic research now is still very little, but they're doing it with, you know, uncrewed aircraft, and it's just different than having a person in the cockpit.
As you mentioned during your presentation, the scramjet version would have been the next follow-on that would be logical. And if that had continued, it'd been so much better, in my opinion.
Yeah, where would we be today if that had happened? You know, we sort of took a left turn when we went into these capsules and stuff that we went with Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. I think we went back the right direction with the Space Shuttle. It certainly went with the right direction there that the X-15 had shown us. And now we're going back to the capsules again, and we're losing that ability for that real controlled flight that we had before. And it's a sad thing to sort of see that. We're just getting the, you know, the nickname for, you know, say Orion is Apollo on steroids. It's just a bigger version of Apollo. And sure, it may be a lot more sophisticated. It's got a higher technology in it, but it's still a capsule. It's not really a spacecraft, a space vehicle like we had.
Yeah, well, hopefully Dream Chaser, they have the cargo contract. Hopefully then they'll be able to go to the crewed version of the Dream Chaser.
That would be great. We would love to see that. We would definitely love to see that.
Right, Sierra Space is working on something in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wanted to thank you again for being here and everyone else for joining us, because having audience and having interaction, it definitely adds up to the value and of the presentation and the whole program. And I am looking forward to seeing you at the various, I know you're very active in aerospace community and attend the multiple events. And so I hope to interact with you in person in one of the either Ascend or the AAA, IAC, or a Space Congress, whatever next event that you will be at. And I'm looking forward to seeing you, meeting you in person, and thanking you in person. We need to have that cup of coffee together.
I would love to sit down with you sometime. I hope that works out. And it's been such a pleasure to be here. And I really enjoy doing these presentations. I cannot believe that it's 12 years in and I'm still doing as many presentations. This one today is number 154 for my X-15 presentations. I have this personal goal of making at least to 199, just like the number of X-15 flights. We'll see if we get there, but it's still going on. This is actually my third talk in less than a week. This is the first one I've done over Zoom this week, but I've had 2 other in-person talks that I've done. And I've got another one coming up in a week and a half, and other ones coming up, in the future. I have several different talks now on the X-15 program. This is the primary one based on the book. I have another talk geared toward the life and what happened with Michael Adams and the X-15. I'd be glad to come back and do that for you at some point. And my newest talk, which is one I'm really excited about, is called My Adventures with the X-15. And it's actually the one that gives my personal story of what I did, why I did it, and stuff like that with the X-15, and what the ongoing adventure is as well. And so I've been getting a lot of requests for that new one as well. So if you ever have any other need to talk about the X-15, I would be glad to bring my other presentations and speak with you all again.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to those 2 that you mentioned, and whatever future we'll be holding, and other future talks that you are working on. I am looking forward to hearing them here and in real life.
And hopefully some of those presentations are to a lot of young people too, so that you're introducing them to the history.
Yeah, we are actually having a lot of young people. I really love going to the talks, and especially after the talks, I'm finding there's a lot of people that are bringing their children up to speak with me. They're, I'm doing book signings and stuff like that. And a lot of times they'll actually have me inscribe the book to their child, which is pretty neat. And so to see people being fascinated by that is great. A real quick example is that we have this friend that works out at a local Walmart, and we went out there to see her right after the book came out, and we were all excited to show her a copy of the book, and it's like, gee, it's actually been published. And so we were talking to her about the X-15. She really had no idea what the X-15 was until she heard it from me. But there was this other young associate who was there, who was like 16 years old, who was there for a little part-time job, and she overheard us talking about it, and she came running over. It's like, you wrote a book on the X-15? And it's like, this is a 16-year-old girl that knew about the X-15. And it's like, the world is going to be a safe place when we have people like that out there. So that was pretty cool to see. Excuse me.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And real quick, I noticed there's a couple of questions we didn't get to. Let me just pop them out real quick. Daniel asked about the oxidizer and fuel tanks on the X-15 and if they could be topped off from the B-52 prior to release. And yes, they were. They had those on board the B-52 and made sure they topped everything off just before launch. And the other one is, was the engine throttled to reduce G's and loads on the vehicle, or were there other reasons for it? And actually, no, it was never throttled because of reduction of G's. The whole reason for the throttling was to be able to put the X-15 into the right speed and altitude range that they would need for a specific experiment, either for study of the X-15 itself or the carry-on experiment. Excuse me. And so that was the purpose of that. So there was often times when they would say, okay, we need to get up to Mach 5 and we need to hold it right there. So they were throttling the engine back to make sure they achieved just exactly the right speed and altitude and attitude parameters for that experiment. So that was the point of that. So just want to make sure that those got out there before we shut down. So
perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Michelle, again for such a fascinating presentation. I will stop recording right now